Fairhaven, Ohio, it's the kind of place you see on a postcard. Manicured lawns, kids riding bikes until the streetlights come on, and neighbors who actually know each other's names. In late 2002, this town felt like the safest place on earth. But as the holiday season approached, a darkness was moving in, one that would change this community forever. On Christmas Eve, while most families were wrapping last-minute gifts, a young man named Mark Brooks made a phone call that would spark the largest search operation in the state's history. His wife, Elena, was gone. She was 8 months pregnant. To the world, they were the perfect couple. But as the snow began to melt and the secrets began to surface, the world would learn that perfect is often just a very good mask. Today, we're looking at a case that proves that sometimes the person you think you know best is a complete stranger. December 24th started like any other Tuesday for Elena Brooks. She was 27 years old, a substitute teacher, and she was glowing. She was just weeks away from giving birth to her first son. Her nursery was ready, the clothes were folded. The names were picked out. According to Mark, he left the house around 9:30 a.m. He told Elena he was going to head down to the Clearwater Reservoir to do some fishing. It was a bit of a drive, 90 miles, but Mark loved the water. He said goodbye to his wife, loaded his boat, and drove away. When he returned home later that afternoon, the house was strangely quiet. Usually, Mackenzie, their golden retriever, would be barking. Instead, Mark found the dog in the backyard, still wearing his leash. The side gate was open. Mark walked inside. The house was empty. Elena's purse was still on the table. Her keys were there. Even her cell phone. It looked like she had just stepped out for a moment and never came back. At first, Mark didn't panic. He called her mother. He called a few friends. But by 6 p.m., the sun was down, the temperature was dropping, and there was still no sign of Elena. That's when the first 911 call was placed. Within an hour, the Brooks' front yard was a sea of blue and red lights. The police didn't wait. Usually, with adults, there's a 24-hour grace period, but a woman who is 8 months pregnant, that's a high-priority emergency. The search was massive. We're talking helicopters with thermal cameras, K9 units, and hundreds of local volunteers. People walked through the woods in lines, shoulder to shoulder, calling Elena's name into the cold night air. But while the volunteers were frantic, the detectives started noticing something. They began to watch Mark. In these types of stories, we often talk about victimology, who the victim was. But we also talk about behavioral analysis. When a husband loses his pregnant wife, you expect a certain level of devastation. But Mark was different. Detectives noted he was unusually calm. He didn't ask many questions. He didn't seem to want to help with the search organized by the family. When the media put a camera in his face, he seemed more annoyed than heartbroken. Then, there was the fishing trip. Detectives asked Mark, "What were you fishing for?" Mark replied, "Sturgeon." The problem? The Clearwater Reservoir isn't known for sturgeon in December. And Mark couldn't even remember what kind of bait he had used. When the police searched Mark's truck and his warehouse, they found something even more suspicious. In the back of his shop, there were rings of dried concrete on the floor. It looked like someone had been making homemade anchors. But when they searched Mark's boat, the anchors were gone. In the first few weeks of the search, the community of Fairhaven stood firmly behind Mark. There were candlelight vigils held every night. People wore ribbons. Elena's family held press conferences where Mark stood in the background, looking like a man crushed by the weight of a tragedy. But on January 15th, the illusion of the golden couple didn't just crack, it shattered. A woman named Nicole Reed walked into the local police department. She wasn't from Fairhaven. She lived 2 towns over. She was a massage therapist, a single mother, and she had a story that would change the course of the investigation. Nicole handed the detectives a stack of photos. In them, she and Mark were laughing, holding each other, looking very much like a couple in love. She told the detectives they had been dating since November. But here's the most chilling detail. Mark had told her he was a widower. He told her he had lost his wife months ago and that this would be his first Christmas alone. When Nicole saw Elena's face on the news, she realized the man she was falling for wasn't a grieving widower. He was a man whose pregnant wife was currently missing. The police asked Nicole for her help. They wanted her to record her phone calls with Mark, and what those tapes revealed was haunting. While the town was out in the freezing cold searching for Elena, Mark was on the phone with Nicole, whispering sweet nothings. He told her he was in Europe celebrating the New Year, when in reality, he was at a vigil for his missing wife. The public's sympathy evaporated overnight. The man who was once the grieving husband was now the prime suspect in the court of public opinion. People began to ask if he could lie about her being gone before she was even missing. What else was he capable of? While the recordings provided a motive, the police still needed physical evidence. They returned to Mark's warehouse with a specialized team of forensic investigators. They focused on his boat. Mark claimed he was fishing, but the boat was suspiciously clean. However, they found a single hair caught in a pair of pliers in the boat. DNA testing would later confirm it belonged to Elena. Then, they looked at his computer. In the weeks leading up to the disappearance, Mark hadn't been researching baby strollers or cribs. He had been researching water currents in the Clearwater Reservoir. He had been looking at maps of the deepest parts of the bay. He had even been checking the weather and tide schedules for December 24th. The detectives also revisited the concrete evidence. Remember those rings of dried concrete on the floor? They found a receipt showing that Mark had bought a 90-pound bag of cement just days before Christmas. When they weighed the remaining cement in the bag, there was a massive amount missing. The theory was starting to take shape. The prosecution believed Mark hadn't gone fishing at all. They believed he had used those homemade anchors to ensure that the secrets of Fairhaven would stay at the bottom of the reservoir forever. But without a discovery, without finding Elena, the case was purely circumstantial. In the eyes of the law, it is very difficult to prove the unthinkable happened if you don't have the proof of the tragedy itself. As winter turned to spring, the tension in Fairhaven was at a breaking point. Mark continued to live in the house. He even began selling Elena's belongings. He sold her car. He talked about putting the house on the market. It was as if he was trying to erase her existence before the investigation was even over. But the earth and the water has a way of revealing the truth when the seasons change. By April, the search for Elena Brooks had officially gone cold. The media cycle was moving on, and the town of Fairhaven was trying to return to some sense of normalcy. But nature has a way of bringing the truth to the surface. On April 13th, a massive storm hit the region, churning the waters of the Clearwater Reservoir. The next day, a couple walking their dog along the marshy shoreline noticed something unusual tangled in the reeds. It was the remains of a small infant. The following day, less than a mile away, the remains of a woman were discovered. The news hit Fairhaven like a tidal wave. Even before the DNA results were in, everyone knew the location wasn't a coincidence. This was the exact spot where Mark Brooks claimed to be fishing on the day his wife vanished. This was the place he had researched on his computer. When the forensic report came back, the details were heartbreaking. Elena was still wearing her maternity clothes. The tragedy was no longer a missing person case, it was now a recovery of justice. As soon as the remains were identified, the police moved to arrest Mark, but they found that Mark was already preparing for a different kind of journey. When they pulled him over near the border, Mark Brooks looked like a different man. He had dyed his hair and beard a sandy blonde. In his car, police found nearly $15,000 in cash, several cell phones, camping gear, and his brother's driver's license. To the investigators, this didn't look like a man in mourning, it looked like a man on the run. The trial began in the fall, and it was the most watched event in the state's history. The prosecution's case was like a puzzle. They didn't have a single smoking gun and no weapon, no eyewitnesses to the act itself. What they had were hundreds of small pieces that, when put together, created a chilling picture. They played the tapes of Mark flirting with Nicole Reed while the search was ongoing. They showed the jury the concrete residue in his warehouse. They presented the GPS data from his truck. The defense tried to argue that Mark was simply a bad husband who had an affair, not a man capable of the unthinkable. They suggested that a third party had taken Elena to frame Mark, but the jury wasn't buying it. The most powerful moment of the trial wasn't a piece of evidence. It was the testimony of Elena's mother. She looked Mark directly in the eyes and asked him why. Mark, as he had been since the very first day, remained expressionless. His stone-cold demeanor, which he thought made him look innocent, was exactly what convinced the jury of his guilt. After weeks of testimony, the jury retreated to deliberate. The entire country waited. On the third day, the bell rang. Guilty, Mark Brooks was sentenced to spend the rest of his life behind bars. He would never see the sun as a free man again. He would never have the chance to start that new life he had tried so desperately to build on the ruins of his old one. The case of Elena Brooks led to the passage of Elena's Law, which ensures that in cases of tragedy involving expectant mothers, the law recognizes two lives lost, not just one. Today, Fairhaven is quiet again. But if you talk to the people who lived through that winter, they'll tell you that the town lost more than just a neighbor. They lost their innocence. They learned that the golden couples we see on the surface often have the darkest shadows underneath. Elena and her son were finally laid to rest together. And while the justice system did its job, the tragedy serves as a haunting reminder. Secrets can be buried, and they can be sunk into the deepest waters. But eventually, the truth always finds its way home.